So today we're going to talk about perfectionism, its benefits and its drawbacks, both on a global and on an individual scale. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, both for yourself and for everyone else, consider subscribing to the channel. So I have a confession to make. I am, I guess, what you might call a lazy perfectionist, which is to say, I'm lazy. There are lots of things I don't want to do. I want to do as little as possible to get something done. But on the other hand, I'm also a perfectionist. I don't like it when I make mistakes. I get angry when I make mistakes. In fact, I get really angry at myself. I know that a lot of the origin of my own sort of self-dislike, insofar as I have it, which is quite a bit really, is because of that kind of latent perfectionism. It's dwelling on past mistakes. It's dwelling on past faults and errors and things that I wish I had done differently and done better. So I don't like to make mistakes, and I imagine that I'm probably pretty much like a normal person in that way. I think many of us are in that same situation. Even if we may not be perfectionists, there's a sense in which we really don't like to make mistakes. And of course, there's a lot to be said for that kind of perfectionism. It's the kind of spur to action, it's the kind of spur to effort that makes us try to make ourselves better. That's why we're on a path like this, is to try to make ourselves better people. And so there are elements of perfectionism that are certainly useful, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. But there's also elements of perfectionism that can be harmful both to ourselves and to others. And I've just touched on some of that with our own sort of tendency towards self-dislike or self-hatred. But it also can be the sort of thing that can be a problem on a societal or a global scale as well. In fact, some of the problems with perfectionism actually get worse as we get into larger and larger groups of people. Now, what I'm going to say here may be somewhat controversial, but I think it's true nonetheless, which is that the world is not perfectible. We can't expect to have a perfect human society of any kind of scale. And to the extent that we actually are able to achieve something like that, we certainly can't expect it to persist for any significant period of time. A perfect world, a perfect political system, a perfect social system, a perfect kind of justice is a kind of fairy tale. The very famous philosopher Karl Popper in the 20th century, late 20th century, talked about this, and he talked in particular about the philosophies of Plato as well as certain of the philosophies of Marxism, both of which tended to aim towards a kind of perfectionism. Plato believed that a perfect society might be achievable, but it could only be achievable if the perfect society, or if the society was ruled over by philosopher kings, that is, kings who had been developed with a philosophical mindset to be perfectly wise, and so who knew exactly what to do at every turn. And given this kind of leadership, he believed human society was perfectible. And since it may be that he believed that this was possible, it was a sort of thing that he thought could be striven for, or at the very least other people thought that he thought could be striven for, so it was a sort of thing that we should keep in mind. And Karl Popper noticed this point in Plato and in later philosophies and criticized it because he said that it's the sort of thing that tends to lead against what he called the open society. An open society of argument, of difference of opinion, and so on, because the fact is that if we're going to say that there's a certain segment of the population that knows the right thing to do, then what we're doing is leaving aside a large portion of the population as not being worthy of consideration when it comes to political or social decisions. Or to put it another way, we know that there's an enormous amount of disagreement about what a perfect society would be like. Let's assume that the utopia is possible, that perfectionism is possible on a global scale. Well, if you go around a room of 10 people and ask them what that would look like, you're going to get 10 different answers. And so the question is, which one of those is right? Now, for the purpose of argument, we might say, let's assume one of them is right. Does that really matter? Because the fact is that you'll have 9 people or 8 people or at least some segment of the population that's not going to be happy with this. Now, it may be that in some sense they are deluded, and maybe in some sense that they don't understand things properly, but nevertheless, simply by denying them the opportunity to say their piece and to get their opinion about this global society into action, we are basically shutting down their portion of the conversation. And to Karl Popper, what this meant was that instead of having an open society of open dispute and contention, what it led towards was a closed society where one segment of the population got to dictate the way things could be to everybody else. The very idea that there might be a perfect society in that sense tends to lead then towards a kind of attachment to views, because the viewpoint of what that perfection might look like is the kind of thing that we then become attached to. And as we become attached to it, it's not only that we have arguments and disputes, because those go on no matter what we believe. There's always going to be room for argument and difference of opinion. But the arguments can become quite vicious, because to the extent that we think that there's a certain perfection that can be achieved, we're liable to wish, or we're liable to believe, that there's a lot of effort we can put in to suppressing people who disagree with us, because it looks like the end goal is so great that it might be worth doing some bad things in the interim to achieve it. And this, in fact, has been the problem with a lot of the politics of the 20th century. This view towards a perfect or a utopian society down in the distance somewhere, which was supposedly or appeared to be so great that people were willing to put up with, indeed, great harm in the interim. And when it turned out that utopian society was nowhere to be found, what you ended up with was simply an enormous amount of great harm in the purpose, in the cause of a view that ended up being a kind of illusion. So I think the wise kind of opinion to take about perfection on a global scale or on a societal scale is that it's a great thing to shoot for. It's a great ideal to have, but not the kind of ideal that we should expect to be actually achievable. Or if it is the sort of thing that is achievable perhaps in some distant future, then we should be very concerned about the means we use to achieve that end. We should be sure that the means we use are also just, because otherwise this kind of idealization of a perfect end, of a perfect society, can lead to mental rigidity. It can lead to our sense of other people not being human because they don't share our views about this thing. It can lead towards great harm. And most importantly, I think, in a moment-to-moment way, politically, it can lead to an inability to compromise. Because compromise, for both sides, is always a sacrifice away from perfection. In other words, both sides, or all sides of any particular issue, will have some goal that they're after that they feel is at least perhaps ideal in the circumstance. And if they're going to be willing to compromise or able to compromise with others, they're going to have to be willing to, at least temporarily, put that idealization on hold or minimize it to a degree in order to make a deal with people around them who don't agree about this thing. Now, it's important to note that, of course, we all should have limits on how much we're willing to compromise. There can certainly be made arguments that if you compromise with the wrong people, you can, as it were, sell your soul to the devil. You can do things that are so bad in the service of compromise that the compromise isn't worth it. Part of the secret of political wisdom, I think, is being able to see where that fuzzy line is, because it's different in every circumstance. Of course, there are going to be bright lines somewhere involving, let's say, a genocide or a wide-scale misery. But there also are many, many examples where we might say that this specific thing, although it may not entail that, is sufficiently bad that we're not willing to compromise. However, we have to be aware of the fact that every time we do this, we're making a temporary ideal less achievable, because in intransigence, we're simply saying that we're not willing to deal with other people on a social one-to-one scale. That is to say that I think one of the elements of true wisdom, particularly in politics, but also in daily life, is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is a statement that I heard in philosophy discussions. You may have heard of it as well. If you haven't, I think it's a very, very important almost a cliche, but an important one to keep in mind. One of the hearts, I think, of wisdom is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. To some extent, of course, all of us will have an ideal. All of us will have an ideal of what it is to be perfect, or what a perfect day would be like, or what a perfect society would be like, or what a perfect house would be like, or what a perfect partner would be like. But if we're willing to neglect opportunities which may not be perfect as they arise, if we're willing to neglect those or reject those simply because they are not perfect, what we're liable to end up with is something significantly worse than any of the options we were presented with. So, for example, if we are completely unwilling to compromise with other people politically, even when it's on issues that are not of the most importance, then we'll find that we're not able to have actual political power in the world, because no one is going to be willing to join with us on a common program, except people who already agree with us. And no matter what you do politically, you're going to have to make a common cause with people who are not entirely on board with you, because given any group, as I've said before, given any group of 5 or 10 or 15 or 500 people, you're going to find a lot of different opinions about things. So I've been talking about societies and politics up until now, but what I say about societies and politics goes just as well when we think of ourselves. And I say, I'm a lazy perfectionist. I'm a perfectionist about myself in many ways. And I can see that that kind of perfectionism, while, again, it has its uses, it has its benefits, in its depth is problematic, because it tends to lead towards self-hatred. Just as perfectionism in politics can lead to hatred of others, hatred of anyone who disagrees with us to any respect, so too, self-perfection in ourselves can lead to that kind of self-hatred, a kind of unwillingness to accept ourselves as being human, as being somebody who makes mistakes. So, for example, just to take a silly example, a couple of days ago, I was trying to drive out of a very bad turn where there was a car that was parked on the sidewalk blocking my view of traffic. And after waiting there for a few minutes, I got a little bit impatient. And so I began to nose my way out into traffic because I didn't think there was somebody coming, but there was. And fortunately, he stopped. But the car on the other side, by the time I had sort of maneuvered and sort of stopped myself, another car had come. It was kind of a mess. I basically blocked traffic for, let's say, maybe 15 seconds. But being the kind of perfectionist that I am, it's something that I have gone over in my mind many times. Because, look, if you want to put it a certain way, you can say, I almost caused an accident. I certainly held up, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe a dozen people for maybe 15 or 20 seconds from doing what they wanted to do. And I take that personally. And of course, I say this to say that this is obviously a kind of mental proliferation in the Buddhist terminology. It's something that doesn't help. And it's something that comes from this kind of perfection. Because when you have that kind of perfection in your mind stream, as it were, it tends to come up in all kinds of situations where it really isn't helpful. So basically what it is clinging to the ideal of a perfect self, is clinging to a certain kind of view about yourself, which is obviously not accurate. It's obviously something that is a kind of an illusion. It's a kind of a delusion. But it's nevertheless a view. It's a kind of concept, a self-concept of a person who doesn't make mistakes, of a person who's always wise and always kind and always without stress, as I've said on this channel. This is the aim that we're shooting for. But in shooting for that aim, I mean, this is something that Buddhist teachers, wise Buddhist teachers, come back to time and again. When we're shooting for a particular aim, we have to be careful not to become efforting about it, not to become clinging to, not to become too clingy about it. because this can lead to a kind of mental rigidity. It can lead to unhappiness, in fact. We can, ironically, become unhappy if we are taking too seriously our direction, our self-direction towards a particular goal, even a goal that might be to our own benefit. And also, as well as being a clinging to a kind of ideal of the self, a perfect self, which doesn't exist, it can also be a kind of clinging to what's called rites and rituals, or rules and rituals. And this is one of the things that the Buddha argues against, or warns us against. Because of course, within the Buddhist system, there's all kinds of rules. The 5 precepts, for example, which are part and parcel of ordinary ethical action. And we can take the 5 precepts as a group of commandments, and in which case we are basically clinging to rules and rituals, which isn't to say we should, willy-nilly violate the 5 precepts. Of course we shouldn't. Ethical action is to keep them. But we have to understand the reason why we're supposed to keep them. The reason is that the important thing is to act out of kindness and out of compassion for others. And so if violating one of these precepts really would be to the benefit of somebody else, of more people than it would harm, let's say, or it would be of more benefit than harm, then we should actively consider violating that precept. Saying that, I have to say that you have to be very careful here, because to be perfectly serious here, forms of genocide have been attempted to be argued for on the basis of this kind of argument. They'll say, oh, these people, whoever they might be, if we just got rid of all of them, then we'd all be much happier. And we know that that's a delusion, and a very dangerous one. So we have to be very careful when we're pushing against these precepts. But nevertheless, the point is not to hold them as a kind of fetish. There's a reason for them being there, and it's not because they're given by some god that says you have to hold them under every circumstance, no matter what. Another thing to keep in mind, I think, with the self, when we're talking about the self, our own self-identity as perfect beings, is that a lot of us in the West, I think, have come under the sway of a kind of thinking that persists from ancient Greece, which is this notion of the self, and I've talked about this in the context of Stoicism, this notion of the self as being, in some sense, perfectly rational. And that if we could only sort of bracket that part of the mind that wasn't perfectly rational, the emotional part, let's say, that then we would be acting perfectly. Then we would be perfect beings. And this is the kind of view that you get in parts of ancient Greece, I believe from Pythagoras and his followers, which was a large portion of the ancient Greek philosophers that were influenced by Pythagoras' thinking. And I raise this because several of the most important psychological experiments and experimenters of the late 20th century, in particular Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, did a number of very detailed and large studies with people around the world about human rationality. And the one thing that they found, or one of the things that they found, is that the human mind is not particularly rational. And that's not to say that it sort of deviates from rationality in random ways, it's not absolutely perfect, that's something we would expect, but rather that it functions in a completely different way. That the way that we tend to come towards issues that might be considered issues of rationality, such as statistical questions about, what's more likely under what circumstance, which are really, you can make fun of them, but the fact is that they're very, very important to wisdom, to wise actions, to know statistically what's most likely. That we have what's called heuristics, mental heuristics, or mental kinds of techniques that we use that are absolutely completely wrong, that just get things systematically wrong. And that when Kahneman and Tversky gave these experiments, even to trained professionals, that is, professional logicians, professional statisticians, people who had been with this material their entire professional lives, they had the same response. They had the same results. In other words, trained individuals were no better at getting themselves out of these kinds of particular questions than the general public was. Now, of course, if they had been given time and keying to understand, okay, this is the kind of question that we're after, and they probably would have gotten them right, because they knew how to do them properly in a way that you and I probably wouldn't. But nevertheless, the fact is there that we are inherently not rational beings. We're beings that behave irrationally. I mean, a perfect example would be the question about what's more likely, to die in an airplane accident or in a car. And almost everybody tends to be more afraid of airplanes than cars, airplane travel. But airplane travel is much, much safer than automobile travel. Or there's the question, is it more likely to die by being struck by lightning, or is it more likely to die in a terrorist attack? And of course, it's much more likely to be killed by lightning by several times than it is to die in a terrorist attack in the United States, just given the statistics. These are examples of ways that we tend to overplay the statistical likelihood of things that we can easily bring to mind, because a terrorist attack or an airplane crash is very easily brought to mind. It's very vivid, in a way that car accidents aren't as vivid. We tend to overstate the things that are more vivid. We tend to overbelieve, to believe that they're more likely than they really are, and to believe that the ones that are less vivid in our minds are less likely. So this is a way that this heuristic works, in terms of vividness rather than in terms of actual statistics. It's important to realize that humans in general are not perfect beings, and we shouldn't expect them to be, and we shouldn't expect them to behave perfectly. And that perfection is not a matter of cutting off some part of the mind or some part of the world, but rather it's a matter of a whole-scale kind of re-understanding of everything. And it's not the kind of thing that we can expect on a global scale, and it's not the kind of thing that we can expect on a personal scale. And when I started with this channel, I was brought up to, face-to-face with this question, because when I started this channel, I knew nothing about making videos. I knew nothing about the audio that was involved. I have a lapel mic now. I didn't at the beginning. I have lighting that helps you see me better, and I didn't at the beginning. I was aware of the fact that I was sort of jumping into the deep end of something, and I was going to make a lot of mistakes. And I'm sure, making a lot of mistakes. And I know that there's lots of things that I could do to make it better, but there's only so much, in one afternoon, especially if you're, as you say, a lazy perfectionist, or as I've said, a lazy perfectionist. There's only so much that I'm, capable of doing at any one time. But the point is, as I think Casey Neistat and other people have said, done is better than perfect, which is sort of a corollary of the previous thing I had to say about perfection. Done is better than perfect. It's better to get something done and finished and move on to the next, because you'll learn. You'll learn. Life is a learning experience. The Buddha himself also compromised a lot with people, and I think that's often forgotten. When we think about Buddhism, we think of an ethic of perfection. We think of a path of perfection, and indeed it is, at least in its most pure form. But the Buddha himself, after all, did, simply by opening up the saṅgha, opening up the group of monks to consistent and constant contact with lay people, and to a dependence upon lay people for food, for lodging, for money, because the money would be used for building houses, for achieving land so that they could stay somewhere, and so on, that he was opening themselves up to a kind of the opportunity for imperfection, for the opportunity for problems, the opportunities for all kinds of difficulties. And indeed, so it remains to this day. Many ways that the saṅgha is imperfect today are because of corruption of various kinds, and that's to be expected. So if he had wanted the saṅgha to be literally really perfect, there's no reason to believe he would have consented to contact with lay people, just to take one example. Another example that I've discussed before is that the Buddha was at least once confronted, it seems, by one of the kings, because the Buddha was ordaining or bringing into the monastic order soldiers from their armies. And this king was very upset about that, because obviously people would prefer, in general, or many people would prefer to be a monk rather than to be in mortal danger in the army. The king must have given him an ultimatum, the Buddha an ultimatum, and the Buddha reversed that rule, and basically said he would not ordain people who were in the military. This is an example that Richard Gombrich, the great Pali scholar, has talked about as an example of willingness to compromise. And one of the very famous justifications that the Buddha gives in the Vinaya, which are the rules for monastics, one of the very famous justifications he gives for making certain kinds of rulings is that they're not really going to make lay people happy, that lay people want things a certain way, and if you, as a result, if you do certain things, even that aren't particularly bad, but that the lay people don't like, that it can be a problem. And so the Buddha was willing to change some of the monastic rules because of lay dislike. And that's another example where the Buddha was willing to compromise politically. So even within Buddhism, we find this willingness to compromise, this openness to the outside world, this awareness, if you like, of the causal interrelatedness of all things, of the causal interrelatedness of us with other people who may not agree with everything we believe. And so this willingness to compromise was fundamental both in Buddhism and should be in our own lives. And to move back to this issue of statistics, this is actually something, there was an article a while back, there have been many articles, but there was one a while back that dealt with this issue of how likely certain events are. And it was one of the things that I dealt with on my Patreon channel is to bring up one of those articles and sort of raise it as an object of discussion. So if it's something you're interested in, you might want to check out the page or discuss it here below. And I hope we can catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks a lot.